And you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah. We wanted to dive into the topic of Israeli weaponry and specifically the use of artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology being used by Israel's genocidal army and sold by Israel on the market to other states.
Our colleague Michael Brown wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago about the Israeli military's use of facial recognition to collect information about Palestinians in Gaza using tech from Coresight, a private Israeli company. Michael writes that, quote, Israel's apartheid army detained, interrogated, and beat Palestinian poet Mus'ab Abu Toha, a graduate of Syracuse University, with the assistance of Coresight's facial recognition technology. Other Palestinians have been similarly detained via Coresight technology. Joining us to talk about this is Antony Loewenstein. Antony is a journalist and the author, most recently, of the Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. Antony joined us on the Electronic Intifada podcast last year to talk about his book, and we're so pleased to have him back with us today. Welcome, Antony.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be back.
Thanks. Let's begin by having you talk about Coresight, a company that Israel is currently helping battle test its products in Gaza. You've written about Coresight in your book, The Palestine Laboratory, and you lay out how this company or rather lay out for us how this company is operating during the genocide that's going on in Gaza right now.
Just briefly, so Coresight's been around for a number of years, and in the past it's worked in facial recognition with brutal police forces from Brazil and elsewhere. And as I talk about in my book, the company has also worked with various companies and individuals in the occupied West Bank to, inverted commas, perfect that technology on Palestinians. The focus then was more the West Bank. Now, fast forward, obviously, to after October 7, and both what I was hearing and reporting, but also there was that New York Times story a few weeks ago, which I guess confirmed it, although I'd heard this before that story came out, that Coresight was working with the Israeli military alongside, I might add, Google Photos. Now, the role of Google in Israel, along with Amazon, many viewers will be aware of this, have been assisting with the Israeli military with cloud services for a number of years, and there's been a long campaign by staff of both companies to try to stop that. But what we know now is, and I'm sure viewers have seen this as well, you know, since October 7, there's often been footage that's emerged from Gaza, which shows long lines of Palestinians walking from A to B, essentially being forcibly moved, ethnically cleansed from part of the Gaza Strip to somewhere else. And often you would see this almost sort of on stilts, this sort of camera, which we always presume was some kind of facial recognition technology, which it clearly was, almost certainly owned by Coresight. And what they're essentially doing, I mean, the Israelis claim, nonsense, but what they claim is trying to find Hamas militants, the argument being that people are moving from point A to point B. How do we know who's in that population? Maybe there are Hamas terrorists, so they claim, amongst that population. But essentially what's happening is that huge numbers of people's details are being collected. Their data is being collected. There's no consent. And people often are being taken in and arrested and tortured by Israel, both within Gaza and in Israeli prisons, based on what? False information, misidentification. And this is what I've been hearing for a number of months, and this New York Times piece almost, I guess, consolidated that information. But it's an interesting case where I've already seen examples of Coresight since October 7, this is before this New York Times story appeared, potentially promoting itself globally as battle-tested, showing that how effective, again, their words, it is in Gaza, and therefore trying to sell that to particularly police forces around the world. And I'd have to say that history would suggest a number of police forces, both in democracies and dictatorships, would find that very attractive.
And Antony, you know, you use that term battle-tested. It's well known that not just Coresight, but many Israeli weapons companies, like, for example, Elbit Systems, which is the biggest or one of the two biggest in Israel, market their technologies as battle tested and battle proven, which means tested on Palestinians,
Yes.
and tested by murdering Palestinians. If not in this current genocide, I'm sure that's going on now, but many of the weapons that have been sold around the world would have been tested during the previous massacres Israel has carried out in Gaza, for example, in 2014. And we know that weapons, intelligence, surveillance are huge exports for Israel, and various regimes around the world, so-called democracies, as well as others, have been buying these technologies on the basis that Israel is considered to be this country with tremendous technology, tremendous prowess, tremendous capability. And that's been one of Israel's real marketing points. But what we saw on October 7th was this myth being completely imploded by the resistance, which carried out a very sophisticated, very well-planned attack all along the Gaza boundary, completely defeating this $1.5 billion high-tech fence, effectively blinding the Israeli electronic surveillance, and completely collapsing and routing the Israeli military's Gaza division. So was it all PR and marketing? And can Israel recover that reputation, or is it just damaged goods, so to speak?
I would agree with everything you've just said, but there's one important caveat. And the caveat is that although so far, obviously we're, I'd say, only 6 months in since October 7, there's been no real accountability in any way within Israel for what happened, suffice to say. And I've been seeing lots of evidence that, in fact, the companies, including Israeli companies, including some of whose technology or so-called defenses were breached on October 7, are still promoting and marketing and testing in Gaza new technologies since October 7. So let me give you a couple of examples. So there's been 2 major global arms fairs since October 7, one in Paris late last year and one in Singapore in the last couple of months. And in both cases, a lot of Israeli defense companies, Elbit and others, were there promoting certain technology, certain tools, certain drones, certain killer quadcopters, various things that have been used, not on October 7, of course, but in Gaza since, as battle tested. I mean, they openly say so. Look, the question I've been getting a lot in the last months is, doesn't October 7 show what Hamas did, that all this is smoke and mirrors? I mean, on one level, the answer is yes. But on the other hand, I would suggest, based on past history, that in fact there is little evidence to suggest that Israel will not successfully market and sell huge amounts of tech they've been using in Gaza to make massive amounts of money. For example, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which obviously is 2 years ago now, there was, as you guys have reported and I've covered as well, huge amounts of European states buying Israeli missile defense shields and other sort of things. I see no indication, zero, that has changed since October 7. Zero. European states are still interested in buying that tech. In their worldview, Russia is obviously still in Ukraine, which it is, and that conflict is unresolved. It's like a stalemate, really. So I would argue that all those European states that have been relying and wanting on Israeli tech will continue. And secondly, briefly, I think you will see, and I've said this for a number of months, the reason why much of the Arab elites, leadership I'm talking about here, have not cut formal ties with Israel. Yes, they've expressed concern and they're disappointed, all that sort of thing. I think Israeli weapons and surveillance tech is a massive part of that, a huge part of that. What I mean by that is that the last figures we have for Israel's arms industry is 2022. We should get the 2023 figures soon. I mean, this is the official figures, which are always massaged, but we haven't got the 2023 figures. We should get them in the next couple of months. 24% of the 2022 figures were Arab autocracies, a quarter. And I see no indication that any of those Arab states will be less interested in repressive tech from Israel. In fact, I would argue they want them even more, because you've seen in the last 6 months huge amounts of Arabs on the streets protesting really their own government's inaction or complicity in what Israel's doing in Gaza. So I would argue those states, their elites, are even more petrified of their own people. I mean, this to me is the underlying issue, that Arab elites are petrified of the Arab Spring Mark II. I mean, the Arab Spring was, you could argue, didn't succeed as many advocates would have wanted for obvious reasons. But the fact is that those Arab states want that sophisticated repressive tech that Israel sells and markets and is using in Gaza. So, yes, it's possible that October 7 and the complete Israeli failure on that day should negatively impact its arms industry. But honestly, I haven't seen much evidence of that so far.
Wow.
So far.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's always that caveat, so far. And I guess we'll talk about this just briefly, so just to continue, sorry, Nora, is that, and what Israel, of course, has been doing in the last 6 months is almost trying to make everyone forget about October 7. I don't mean rhetorically. Obviously, Israel has been using October 7 as a mantra 24/7. I mean what they're doing in Gaza with weapons and surveillance tech, facial recognition technology is I don't think Israel's been using sophisticated drones simply as a marketing tool. They're using it in their way, so they argue, to fight Hamas. We can accept that or not, fine. But the marketing and selling of it is still a key factor. There's no doubt about that. And Israel's economy, as you guys would be aware, has taken a hit, as you'd expect, after 6 months of war. And even more reason why the Israeli state, I mean, you just probably saw in the last 24 hours, it's worth saying, Naftali Bennett, the unbelievably right-wing racist former prime minister who has aspirations to be prime minister again, put out this long tweet, which I think is worth reading, and I'll paraphrase. It's worth people to look at this. Essentially, he says, and I think this summarizes a lot of the thinking that I'm hearing in the Israeli defense and high-tech sector. He says essentially that Israel needs to become a Silicon Valley Sparta. That's his words, not mine. October 7 was a disaster. I'm paraphrasing him. October 7 was a disaster for us. We were caught asleep. Hamas essentially overtook us. We were weak. What we need to do now is gather ourselves and become a global leader again and become a Silicon Valley Sparta. Now, it's pretty obvious what that means. And I think there are a lot of people in the Israeli political and defense sector who would share that view and will attempt to enact that. I guess we'll see how successful that is. But I think that thinking that he expresses is pretty common.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see in the months and years ahead how realistic that is, given that already prior to October 7th and the genocide, there was a major brain drain and capital flight from Israel. Israel markets itself as this Silicon Wadi, as they call it. But often any successful Israeli startup would quickly leave the country, and the talent too. So we'll see how realistic.
I guess it depends on that front how strong a pull patriotism is, so-called patriotism, right? That the idea that a lot of what I'm hearing from certain people I'm speaking to in the Israeli defense or tech sector is that, and this is not everybody, but a number of people feel almost a patriotic duty to stay in Israel, and market and sell those tools to help the Israeli economy. Now, is that enough people? Who knows? But some will.
Yeah. Well, speaking of some of those weapons, just as someone who researches this and has been for years, these, thinking about the core sight, facial recognition, cameras, in the first couple months of the genocide, I remember there were stories of, when they were dividing the north of Gaza from the south, they set up a massive checkpoint and forced Palestinians who were fleeing the north to move through these containers that had facial recognition scanners attached to them. So we have that. It's unclear whether that was specifically CoreSight or a different surveillance tech. company, or these armed quadcopter drones that we're seeing. I mean, during the siege on Al Shifa Hospital, during the siege on Al Amal Hospital, during the siege on Nasser Hospital, we saw these quadcopter drones not just armed and shooting patients and doctors and medical staff and aid workers inside the hospitals, but also they were outfitted with obviously cameras and loudspeakers, so that the Israeli drone operator, wherever they were, either somewhere close by in a tank or in Tel Aviv or wherever, could use the loudspeaker as well. I mean, what kinds of weapons have we seen during this genocide that are now being marketed to other states? What's specific about the last 6 months that you've really taken notice of in terms of the kinds of weapons here?
There's been a handful that have really struck out to me. And yes, there's obviously been drones have been used by Israel and the US for decades in other states, but particularly since October 7, there's been a real expansion of the kinds of drones that Israel's been using. Some of them have existed before October 7. They didn't suddenly get designed on October 8th, but they've been put into use, into battle, essentially. Some of these, again, there's been a form of suicide drones that existed for years. Israel has marketed and tested those for a number of years. But there's been interesting new forms of a form of suicide drone. They don't call it that, but that's essentially what it is. The quadcopter is a good example of that, Nora, because for years, as I document in the book, in the West Bank for Palestinians, and indeed often when certain Israeli leftists have been protesting in the West Bank, they've had Israeli drones above them issuing instructions, leave the area immediately. Now, obviously, Israeli Jews in the West Bank are normally not killed by drone. There have been exceptions, not by drone, but obviously Israelis can be killed. Where Palestinians, of course, as we know in Jenin and elsewhere, often are killed by drone. Although I think that inevitably is going to start changing. I mean, the idea that somehow Israeli Jews are protected, so to speak, within Israel or Palestine, which was generally the case for years. Of course, there are exceptions. There's been Israelis who have been killed and injured, of course. But in general, I think that'll change, where there is quite clearly a growing war on Israeli leftists, but maybe that's a slightly separate issue. The one I think that stands out the most to me is AI-enabled warfare. And I wrote in my book that AI has been used by Israel in Gaza for a number of years. It's massively exploded in this war, and I'm sure you guys have talked about, and you've seen a couple of reports that have come out in the last months by in 972 magazine, which the people I'm speaking to have roughly backed up that reporting. This is by Yvo.
Antony, we've seen the reports, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers have, but can you just explain in very simple terms what it is? Yeah.
Essentially what these tools that they're using, they being Israel, they called names like Lavender, the Gospel, Where's Daddy? I mean, where to even begin with those sort of titles? Essentially, they are gathering massive amounts of data. This data is coming from either human intelligence Israel has gained over the years, pre-October 7 and since. US intelligence has, as you may recall, soon after October 7, had warships just off Israel, intelligence gathering from there. I've also done reporting through Declassified Australia, the site that I have, that Pine Gap, which is a major US military base in the centre of Australia. You could not be further away from the Middle East than there. The US is gathering massive amounts of intelligence from that military base and sending it to Israel. So Israel's gathering all this intelligence, so-called intelligence. And what those reports essentially said was that the aim was to, so they claim, go after Hamas operatives, regardless of how low level they may be. Now, the impact of that decision, though, was that if there was going to be a, inverted commas, Hamas operative killed, it did not matter if there were dozens and dozens and dozens of Palestinian civilians killed at the same time. And this is also what I'm hearing as well. And there's a one key line that comes up in that report, which is an Israeli intelligence official says that our aim was revenge. Now, obviously, a blind person could see what's been happening in Gaza is based on that. But the decision to target a building, a home, in most of those cases, particularly in the first 3 months of 2023, had very little to no human oversight. In other words, the system is gathering all this intelligence, again, so-called intelligence, all this information, and it's pumping out tens of thousands of targets. This home, this building, this mosque, this school. And it's worth saying, although maybe obvious to viewers who are watching this, that how Israel defines a Hamas operative is pretty problematic, to put it mildly.
Well, it's pretty loose, I think.
Loose, to put it best. That's the polite way.
Just to create an analogy that I've heard someone else make, I don't claim an original authorship over this, but you know, if you think about Hamas is a major political organization, it's dominant in Gaza, so literally everyone knows somebody who is connected in some way with Hamas, and that connection, the person who's connected to Hamas may not be connected at all to their military wing.
Absolutely.
They may be connected to the to a social service agency or to any kind of social institution, but anyone with any connection with Hamas or with that person, whether they're a family member, a friend, a neighbor, someone who provides a service to them, could be considered fair game by this AI system. So the analogy that I heard was if someone said that this AI system is going to be used to destroy the Democratic Party in the United States, and then you're going to this computer system is going to spit out a list of names of so-called Democratic Party operatives. It could be anyone who's ever voted for the Democratic Party, someone who's ever gone door knocking for a Democratic candidate, someone who's a local official in the smallest municipality, and so on and so forth. So basically, you're saying that literally anyone could be targeted. I mean, people have been talking about, you mentioned 972 magazine, and they've revealed a lot of information. This is an Israeli leftist or leftish magazine, but they're calling it a flawed system. Like, in other words, this system is not working the way it should. Whereas the way I see it, and I want you to react to this, is that the system is working exactly as it's intended, because the purpose is not to actually identify so-called Hamas operatives, even members of the military wing, but to provide a justification for killing as many people as possible.
Yeah, look, I've seen also that. I mean, I can't really comment on, yes, I mean, what 972 has said in various places. But I mean, my view about this is that the AI systems, are, as you say, are working exactly as planned. And I've seen this existing before October 7 elsewhere in the world, where the whole rationale behind AI-enabled warfare that the US and Israel has made for years is pinpoint targeting. We're just going to go after the terrorists. We're not going to get civilians. So-called collateral damage, the term which I think is offensive beyond belief, will be minimized. It's all nonsense. Look at what's happening in Gaza, obviously. And I think it's also worth saying that the impact, though, of this kind of warfare, there's a story in Nikkei, the Asian news service, literally 2 weeks ago, which I wrote about, which found that, unsurprisingly, Israel is already promoting AI-enabled warfare to a global market at arms fairs and elsewhere. In other words, it's working exactly as planned in Gaza. The aim is mass destruction. That is the point. And the thing that I keep coming back to over and over again, which the report doesn't talk about because it's not its mission, is this is sort of obvious to say this, but none of this causing mass destruction is making the life of Jews, let alone Israelis, so much more unsafe. It's just insanity. Like this idea somehow that when the US was fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was this geographical comfort. It wasn't next door. It wasn't Mexico. None of it justified what they were doing, of course, but it wasn't on their doorstep. The idea somehow at the end of this, whenever that happens, that Israelis, talking about Israeli Jews, are going to feel safer I mean, you and maybe we obviously know that's obviously not the case, but that aspect of this conversation is so missing. It's absurd. I just find that lack of perspective, because of paranoia, because of revenge, because of bloodlust, because of the political atmosphere, because of racism, all the anti-Palestinianism which we know exists in Israel and much of the Jewish diaspora, sadly, not entirely anymore, but too much so. It's so counterproductive. So what worries me finally is that this justification for using AI to have a cleaner war, in fact, achieves the opposite. And just one final point on this. Of course, since 9/11, when the US was in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were often targeting people who had mobile phones, right? Person X had a mobile phone in Kabul, in Baghdad. They were seen as a terrorist. They were taken out. I'm hearing in Gaza exactly the same thing is happening. So this is part of AI, but also partly the idea that person X is seen to be a Hamas militant. Maybe let's argue that's possibly true, but they pass their phone to somebody else, or they give it to their kid, or they give it to their friend. Who knows? But that person therefore is targeted with dozens and dozens of civilians around.
And that's very common. I can tell you that it's very common, even before this genocide, that people buy and sell SIM cards.
Absolutely.
So you might have someone's number, and then after a few months you call them, and it's someone else completely who picks up that phone is no longer theirs. And of course, in this time of genocide, working phones are at a premium. So people may be sharing phones, they may be selling, they may be as a service letting people use phones for a little bit of money and so on. So all that is very well taken. And we know that that the phones are used to target people and to track people, and people consider them to be almost targeting devices because Israel can access the entire cell phone network.
Yes.
But I mean, just again, to look at the bigger picture here, because a lot of the reporting and the discussion of the AI has, not surprisingly, looked at the horrifying detail of this, the idea that computer programs are spitting out lists of names of people who are then being targeted, and not just them being targeted, because they say so-and-so who the computer program has identified as a so-called Hamas operative lives in this apartment building with 100 other people, and we're going to drop a 2,000-pound bomb on the apartment building. And that's what's been going on systematically. That's why there is so much destruction and so much killing in Gaza. But again, I want to just make the point about the bigger picture here, that all of this technical detail and horror can, in a sense, make us miss the forest for the trees, which is that after 6 months, Israel has achieved nothing in terms of its stated military goals. The unstated goal is killing and ethnic cleansing and revenge. But the stated goal is to destroy Hamas as a military and political organization, and to bring back the Israeli prisoners of war and captives who are in Gaza. And they've achieved none of that. So again, do you think, I mean, it's one thing for hype and marketing for Israel to say, look at our brilliant technologies. But if you're in a defense ministry in a Western country and you're responsible for spending the money, aren't you going to look at this and say, well, I mean, it's a lot of hype?
It's a good question. I've seen not much evidence of that yet. Again, the caveat is always yet. Everything you say is correct. I mean, completely correct. But again, when we talk, for example, just to go back to the Russia-Ukraine situation, all the European countries that were buying all that missile defense shield and other tech, I don't see any evidence they're going to stop buying it because of October 7 or the last 6 months, apart from the fact that most European states have supported Israel throughout the whole thing, as we know. I don't see any evidence that the Arab states that still rely on repressive tech, as I said before, will stop buying it. I don't see that. I don't see any evidence that they would. Now, you're absolutely right. The stated goals have been a catastrophe. Israel hasn't achieved any of them. It's hard to see how they will. But again, look at the analogy with the US post 9/11. Iraq and Afghanistan were a catastrophic failure, and human rights catastrophe in every way, the American defense sector has never been more successful. It's had no impact whatsoever. In fact, it's had the opposite effect. The opposite effect. Now, I'm not saying every analogy is perfect, but the fact that Israel is failing miserably on its own ambitions, to me, does not necessarily mean that the people who are spending money in Riyadh or Phnom Penh in Cambodia, where apparently there's increasing interest in many
or
Asian
Helsinki
states,
or Stockholm,
yes,
or The Hague or
well, The Hague would be
Berlin.
nice. Yes.
Well, yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it's look, I'm sure, look, anyone who's sensible will maybe have those conversations about saying, well, how effective is this technology? But yeah, I mean, look, I've seen no evidence for it so far. I don't know what to say beyond that. And it's on one level, it's bewildering. On the other hand, the mission often is mass destruction, and many other nations admire that Israel can do that. And one thing I should say, which I say in the book consistently, is many other nations for decades have often come to Israel and asked for advice how to get away with it. This is such a key point, right? Now, is Israel getting away with it in Gaza? Well, yes, of course they are. I mean, we could argue about global public opinion, the potential of sanctions. I agree with all that. But in terms of Israel hasn't stopped. We're 6 months in. They've killed, what, 40,000? We don't even know how many people have been killed. No one's stopping them, really, so far. And many other nations, including, I would argue, states that have been publicly appalled with what Israel is doing, will still end up buying some of those weapons and repressive tech. We all know that.
It's stunning, but no, I mean, that makes sense. It's like they see, you know, how destructive this kind of tech can be, even if it fails to protect the ones using it. Sometimes it's still, you know, the most you know, it's a major global market product.
I should just say one thing. I mean,
Yeah.
when I say that, people might think, that sounds, there's no silver lining. I think the last 6 months, though, have brought up, and which obviously many people with EI and others have talked about arms embargoes for years. There will be some states that will try to impose some. I don't know who that will be. Maybe South Africa. It's not going to be America or the UK or Australia, of course, but some will. And some will. And that's something, in other words, I'm not saying every single country simply is blinded by the so-called brilliance of Israeli repressive tech. I don't think that. But I think you and I know that in the coming months and years, Israel will try and spend huge amounts of money to sell how, inverted commas, effective their repressive tech has been.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, think it's worth, yeah.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I think it's worth mentioning that just last week, the UN Human Rights Council voted by 28-6 to call for an arms embargo on Israel. And of course, there's no surprise as to who the handful of no votes were. There were some abstentions, but the handful of no votes, not surprisingly, included the United States and Germany. And the abstentions also included the Netherlands and France and other close allies of Israel. But we've seen other countries, for example, a court in the Netherlands ordered that country to stop shipping spare parts to Israel. And of course, we just, in recent days, we saw the International Court of Justice hearing the case of Nicaragua versus Germany. And one of the demands of Germany is, one of the demands of Nicaragua is that the court order Germany to stop shipping arms to Israel. Of course, we're talking about Israeli arms exports, but I think it's important to remember that the arms trade goes in both directions.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, without American, and most people don't know this, maybe they do, your audience, but Germany is the second biggest arms provider to Israel, and they've sent massive amounts of arms, even in the last 6 months. People often don't know that, but it's huge.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, your point about you know, is Israeli tech is going to keep being on the world market unless it is stopped by
Absolutely.
arms embargoes.
Yes.
And I mean, it's just it's you know, and also I think about the way that that AI is in this, you know, Israel is trying to kind of you know, massage AI and saying, well, you know, when the computer gives us these, you know, kill lists, then and then it, you know, enacts these you know, these killings on people that it has identified, then you know, Israel is trying to absolve itself as the human military. You know, is this something that international law seems meaningless sometimes in cases like these, but does AI exist in a realm that is kind of a gray area for international law when Israel is finally tried at The Hague for the genocide that is you know, that it has been orchestrating? Like, where does AI fit into that? And do you think that could contribute to something like, you know, a kind of a global shift in how weapons companies are using this technology?
Many international law experts that I spoke to about this, not just in the last 6 months, but before, have said that at the moment, at least, there is a degree of grey area, not because international law supports mass killing of people, but and this has come up an issue in the past years around even spyware, which is a far less destructive weapon, or even drones. When was the last time you saw a major American drone pilot put before The Hague? Never. And obviously there's been drone killings in Iraq and Afghanistan, elsewhere, and Syria.
But we've never seen a conventional American pilot put before The Hague either.
Indeed. Anyone. Completely. Absolutely. Anyone. For sure. I mean, to me, there is and I've seen some attempts to accelerate the conversation around almost updating international law to accommodate. Ultimately, there's a human behind this system. Of course there is, more than one person. There's a whole team of people that obviously are feeding in the information. That the information is coming from somewhere. Information is coming, for example, from whether it's Pine Gap in the center of Australia or American warships in the Mediterranean. So at the moment, there are a number of international lawyers that I know that are trying to push the UN and others to accelerate almost the drafting to update laws because of what we're seeing in Israel and Gaza, because the fear always is that this proves, inverted commas, proves the point that if Israel gets away with that, the mass killing in Gaza, which is not just through AI, of course, but partially, then other states inevitably will follow, as they will. I don't know which ones will, but I could imagine there are various other states that I'm hearing that have expressed real interest in a massively sophisticated system that in some ways, I mean, depends what you define as massively sophisticated. I mean, it's a mass killing machine, essentially, under the guise of automation, but automated killing, which has a lot of appeal. And you're seeing that more. Yeah.
I mean, there are some things that worry me about this. I mean, apart from the obvious things. I mean, for example, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, reacted to some of the reports coming out about how Israel is using these AI, artificial intelligence systems, to compile lists of targets that, you know, is apparently there's no intelligence in it. It's pretty much indiscriminate. It's like taking the phone book. We don't have phone books really anymore, but
I remember that. I'm old enough to remember phone books.
Those of us old enough to remember the phone book. It's like saying, here's the phone book and that's your list of targets. Ultimately, that's what it amounts to. There's very little intelligent about it. But what Antonio Guterres said, and I'm reading, I'm quoting here, he says, "I've warned for many years of the dangers of weaponization of artificial intelligence and reducing the essential role of human agency. AI should be used as a force for good to benefit the world, not to contribute to waging war on an industrial level, blurring accountability." And I worry about that, statements like that, Antony, because there Guterres appears to be expressing concern about the artificial intelligence. But what he's saying, in a sense, is we won't be able to tell who did the crime. But to me, it's no less obvious who did the crime. Israel did the crime. Its leaders did the crime. Anyone who was involved in designing or operating this system did the crime. And I'm going to make an analogy that I make no apology for making, but this artificial intelligence is similar to a death camp, in the sense that, those who are responsible include everyone from those who give the orders to those who manufacture the poison gases or the machinery, or who drive the trains and so on. The idea that, we've got Germany still putting on trial 95-year-olds who were secretaries in, when they were 18 years old in the 1940s in Nazi Germany, and saying they're just as culpable as the person who gave the order at the top. And so if Germany has no trouble saying that a secretary who was 17 years old and who was a typist for some Nazi official should be put on trial in 2022 or 2023 or whenever the most recent trial was, I have no trouble saying that anyone involved in this so-called artificial intelligence killing machine is just as guilty. And I don't share Guterres's concern. They're all guilty, no problem there. But the other question that I have about this, Antony, is that, as we've noticed, some of the reports that have come out about this, some of the most detailed reports, have come out in Israeli publications, which are subject to military censorship. And so the question then is, why does Israel want us to know about these artificial intelligence systems?
In some of the interviews, Yvo Abraham, who I don't know personally, but he's the journalist who's written some of these stories, he's based, I think, I'm not sure, in Israel somewhere, has said there's certain things I can't say or write about because I am subject to Israeli censorship, essentially, military censorship. Now, obviously, I don't know exactly what that is because he can't talk about it. Look, the question of why is this stuff coming out principally in the Israeli, although sort of quasi-alternative press, is an interesting question. I have my theories. I don't know. I think there are, you could argue it's not dissimilar in a way to how during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, various dissidents within the Defense Department or soldiers would go even to the most mainstream journalists in the New York Times. New York Times obviously has blood on its hands from Iraq and God knows how many wars for decades, and yet for a range of reasons wanted to get the audience. You could say the same about WikiLeaks back in the day when Julian Assange was partnering with the New York Times and others. He wasn't a fan of the New York Times or the Guardian or other papers that he was partnering with, but it was to reach the audience. Now, 972 is hardly the New York Times. That's true. It's a relatively small outlet that would get a big audience. Whether we should see that cynically, I don't know. Yeah. Or maybe it's an attempt by certain Israeli intelligence officials to try to absolve themselves of responsibility and to sort of launder their image. We're the good guys inside trying to keep the system honest. Maybe.
Yeah, the timing is also pretty interesting. But yeah. Antony, I wanted to finally, we just have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about activism inside Australia, where you are, and, in terms of discussing the arms embargo, how Australians are trying to pressure their lawmakers to, respect international law, to abide by the responsibilities toward the Palestinian people, and to stop being involved in the weapons trade with Israel. What's going on there?
Well, Australia, unsurprisingly, has been a pretty strong supporter of Israel from the beginning, has been for decades, really.
Yeah.
And like we mentioned before, that case in the Netherlands a few months ago where there was an attempt successfully to stop the government sending key parts to Israel. Australia has exactly the same situation. It hasn't been a successful court case, but Australia also is a key part of the global supply chain that we, when I say we, not me, we as a country are sending key parts to Israel, have for years and have been doing, from my understanding, since October 7 as well. There is a growing movement here of trying to stop Israeli shipping companies that are docking in Australia. People may have seen that online. There is a growing sense that in certain that we have an election here in about a year. When there is an election here in certain seats that are held by the Labor Party, which is the party in power here, there is profound anger around Labor's support for Israel. And I think it's not dissimilar to what we're seeing in certain states in the US with the Democrats, that people are saying, we're not supporting Trump in November, but we're not going to vote for Biden over my dead body because of what's happening in Gaza. Something similar is happening here. And although the election is still a year away, I think that's important to say. There has been massive amounts of protests. I mean, the last 6 months, often there are 50, 100,000 people on the streets protesting. Not every week. It's obviously less than it was. But there is protests on the street still every week, mostly Sydney, Melbourne, but also others, the two big cities. I think what has happened here, which I see in other countries around the world, is beyond people who normally have understanding about Palestine, it has massively expanded people's awareness of what is happening to people who aren't necessarily involved in the past, people who might necessarily have spoken out in the past, people who might not go to a protest in the past, whatever that looks like. And for a lot of people that I speak to, and these are people who write to me a lot, including a lot of people in the Jewish community, by the way, and the issues in the Jewish community which are happening in America, although America is a much more visible example of that increasing generational split that we see, is happening here too, thankfully. And yes, the mainstream major Jewish organizations are 110% behind Israel. That is true. But there are growing numbers of especially young Jews who are speaking out publicly. They have growing numbers of organizations that get media coverage, that get traction, that are being heard. It's mostly younger Jews, though not all. So the picture in Australia in some ways is not dissimilar, I'd say, to other Western states where we have a nation which is very supportive of Israel, has been for years, but it's increasingly politically problematic for the government to do so, even though there's bipartisan support in the country for it. Like in your country, the Republicans are even madly more pro-Israel than the Democrats. Australia, our opposition party, is the same. But in terms of public opinion polls, there's been massive. There's been majority support for a ceasefire for months. There was a poll this week in the UK, which I saw and I knew would be repeated here. There was a poll in the UK, you may guys have seen that this week, which showed that the majority of British people, yes, supported a ceasefire, but also supported both an arms embargo and Britain no longer sending weapons to Israel. There was a story in The Guardian about it a few days ago. I'm positive that a similar case would exist here if that poll was taken. Now, that would not have happened on October the 6th. And that's significant.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The tide has turned in so many places for so many people. And our lawmakers are the ones who won't until they're forced to,
until they're forced to.
Yeah, that's it. Antony Loewenstein, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Electronic Intifada live stream. Again, your book is called The Palestine Laboratory. And we'll put up a link to the podcast that we did. I think it was last June, which seems like it was 100 years ago.
It seems like we haven't aged at all, Nora, but yes,
no, not at all.
It was a while ago.
We're doing great. But yeah, people can go back and watch that really wonderful interview we did about your book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antony.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Antony. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, Ali. I appreciate it. You guys too.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.